Good morning. Did I scare you? No. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this second and unfortunately last day of our conference, international conference. And we are going to keep unveiling the Duke of Parma with Professor Enrico Martinez's paper today, Sexuality and Misoginy in Fernando Pessoa, the Duke of Parma's contribution to the topic. You may already know at this point who Professor Enrico Martinez is, but I'm going to introduce you I'm going to introduce him anyway. So Enrico Martinez is Associate Professor of Portuguese and Brazilian Literature at the University of Parma in Italy. A part of the Estudos da Edição Crítica de Fernando Pessoa collection, he edited the correspondence between Fernando Pessoa and the director of Presença, and studied the history of this magazine, as well as the relationship between the Orfeo movement and the so-called Second Modernism. He has worked on critical genetic editions and philological studies of José Regio's poetry as part of the research team studying and editing José Regio's manuscripts. The results of this work include the publications José Regio, Il poeta di Dio e del Diavolo, José Regio versus Esparsos e Inacabados, e José Regio e os Mestres do Modernismo. He has also published the book I modernisti in Portogallo e in Brasile, I modernismi in Portogallo e in Brasile, as well as essays on modern Portuguese and Brazilian authors. In addition to being the coordinator of this research project, he is the scientific director of the project The Unveiling of Fernando Pessoa Literary Legacy, the Duke of Parma, conceived by Dr. Carlotta De Feno, and to be carried out by her, having been awarded a Horizon MSCA grant. Enrico, the floor is yours.
May I sit?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, following the first day in which we delved into philological and methodological issues, with my paper I will try to adopt a more thematic approach to the Duke of Parma. So, we know that the Duke of Parma is a fragmentary and incomplete tragedy centered on a sexual theme. Pessoa created a protagonist who is both passionate and psychologically disturbed, as well as philosophically restless. Pessoa's Duke of Parma is a chaste figure. Despite rejecting sex, he cannot forget its alluring power, a fact that disgusts him as he seems repulsed by the female body and sexuality. When considering the ideas expressed by the protagonist, it is important to bear in mind that he is a character created by Pessoa to embody mental and emotional instability. Therefore, we should consider that the Duke's ideas may not necessarily reflect the author's beliefs, even though they could have been influenced by various concepts that Pessoa encountered and embraced during his lifetime. A great deal has been written about Fernando Pessoa's sexuality and his unique relationships with women. Perhaps the most relevant study to the themes evoked by the Duke of Parma is José Barreto's Misoginia e Antifeminismo in Fernando Pessoa of 2011. However, other important critics have also expressed their views on the subject, including Eduardo Lourenço, Teresa Rita Lopes, and Richard Zenith. Several monographs have been written on this subject. I will not mention them as not to highlight any omissions, whether intentional or not. I will only cite the collective volume edited by Anna Klobuchka and Mark Sabin, who is here with us to discuss these issues as someone who is clearly informed of the facts. While these studies, as well as others not mentioned here, make fundamental contributions to this subject, they do not draw on knowledge of the work that is the focus of this conference, the Duke of Parma. My aim here is simply to analyze the themes of sexuality and misogyny within this Shakespearean tragedy. To this end, I will present and comment on relevant fragments from the documentary corpus of the Duke of Parma. Regarding the Duke's stance on male supremacy, the following dialogue between the protagonist and Alberto, displayed at the bottom of the page, reveals an intellectual communion between them, a kind of superior union that can only exist between men. This also brings to mind the homoerotic tendencies suggested in various interpretations of some of Pessoa's writings. I have highlighted the most relevant parts which I will comment on. The Duke remarks to him, "Thou art a part of me that's lost," and adds on the left margin, "Thou art an epilogue to my soul. Art thou wert a woman, I would marry thee." This is a relationship that the Duke clearly considers superior to a union with a woman, which he perceives as purely carnal due to what he deems the material and sexual nature of women. A subsequent conversation between Alberto and his sister Hermione further reveals the complex nature of his feelings toward the Duke. Alberto talks about his love for the Duke and his madness. His sister Hermione asks him why he should love the Duke. His answer is ambiguous. He says, "Note, but somehow he's not note. These are loves of the mind as of the body, and a kinship doth lie between some minds, where bodies have no common parentage." For him, the Duke represents a mental rather than a physical love, a connection that transcends physical desire. Once again, there is a reference to a type of love between men, or rather to a bond that goes beyond sexuality, albeit bordering on it. Confirmation of this attitude can be found in this passage. We do not know if the Duke is still addressing Alberto, but he is speaking to someone whom he recognizes as the truest philosopher I have met. Once again, this intellectual communion leads the Duke to verbally express an erotic impulse towards his male interlocutor. "I would kiss thee, as it were not indecency." This impulse is followed by an extremely censorious comment, presumably from a third party or the person to whom the impulse is directed. There is talk of a flowery overflow of lechery. In the verse of the first passage quoted here, we find a clear example of misogyny. In the middle section, the Duke says, "My wife's a fool, like all those part of the world's making." Specifically, he expresses the sentiment that his wife lacks intelligence, a trait shared by all women and all beings that exist solely for the purpose of procreation. In the Duke's view, women are devoid of intellectual capacity. As we can see in the passage on this page, the Duke not only stigmatizes the implicit inferiority of women, but also condemns their duplicity and innate deceitfulness. He says, "Women's arguments are, or serve, not for the understanding of the argument, but for the understanding of the woman. With women, never the superficies of phrase and word matches the soul and senses. They are born liars." He believes that they talk nonsense just to achieve a goal, but never reason. Finally, the Duke admits that these are harsh words, but they are the closest to the truth. Procreation is the fundamental role of women. While this function can be considered extremely noble, the Duke sees its physical manifestation as extremely dirty and disgusting because it involves parts of the female body he finds repulsive. At a solemn and formal occasion, the Duke arrives dressed as a jester, as can be seen from the initial description, and questions one of his counselors, a doctor, as to which is considered more unclean, the birth or conception of a child. Contrary to what the doctor thinks, the Duke considers conception to be dirtier because, as he asks, if a place is dirty, is not going and coming dirtier than mere coming? This is another example of his revulsion towards all things sexual, particularly female sexuality. Accordingly, in another passage, he refers to the dirt of our beginning. And in a dialogue with Alberto, he describes the act of conception as boisterous and animalistic, and therefore regards life itself as inherently dirty. That one another shrieked this bastly and wicked thus when we were conceived. We came of that, Alberto. Consequently, he concludes, I think dirtily upon life. Even in a dialogue with Alberto in the final part of the tragedy, the Duke's almost obsessive vision of the bestiality of conception returns. In his view, this awareness renders any poetic, respectful, and philosophical view of life impossible. He says, if we could see the show or the sight within us of our birth, the carnal and the local view of this, the exact fleshy act that all that tends to, where were this poetry, respect, submission? This is illustrated by the image of the two-arsed beast at active work, where two naked copulating bodies are perceived as a single beast. To this, we can add a monologue by the Duke about the importance of clothing in maintaining decency and honor. In this extract, the idea of the implicit indecency of the human body and the sexual act returns, especially in relation to the female body. Without clothes, the Duke asserts, a woman is reduced to the female animal. He ponders, what would purity and courtship be like if the sex of the body and soul were not hidden? And it is only the unawareness of human nudity made possible by the concealment of the body that makes ideas such as the virginity of the virgin and the purity of the wife possible. He elaborates this even better later in the same scene, in the verse of the same page, when he says, we dress and we forget that we are naked beneath our dresses. All purity is in this. The Duke's disgust for sex and female sexuality is linked to his broader contempt for the physicality and materiality of human beings, as evidenced by this passage. He says, "Note persists, save the vile nature of a living thing, our eating, defecating, procreating, undreamlike thing that spews when it is ill, and that when it is not ill does not spew." As can be seen in an excerpt in which the Duke gives philosophical advice to a boy, sex, and more specifically lust, is one of the realities perceived by ordinary men alongside madness. These are the forces that drive them, alongside fear, feelings that are more tangible than life and death itself. A monologue by the protagonist in the tragedy provides a decisive insight into the Duke's aversion to sex and female sexuality. In it, the Duke denounces the irresponsibility and selfishness of sexual pleasure, which he believes can lead to a life of unhappiness. He begins stating, "I am a fool and a duke, and both these things my father worked out when he thought not of me." Verbs are used to denounce the mechanical and in some ways degrading view of the male sexual act. This is evident at the end of the following sentence, "Art thou sad? Thy father was not when thou beganst to drip or to be spurted." The spermatozoon, the creator that will become such, drips or is spurted out. The man who begets is consumed entirely by his desire and the selfish pursuit of his own pleasure. He has no concern whatsoever for the consequences of his actions, a sentiment emphasized when the Duke remarks, "When our father lay with our mother, there was no thought of us. We came afterwards like an unexpected wind." Consistent with this, the woman in the Duke's passage appears as a mere object of desire, and only the part of her that allows the man to find pleasure is evoked. He says, "Because there is an entry or entrance between women's legs." This irresponsible male selfishness is the source of humanity's suffering, as well as the source of the Duke's suffering. He says, "I am a fool and I am a prince, and both these things came from my father when he scarce knew where his mind was, and thought as little of fools as of princes, my mother's breasts being nearer." Here too, only an erogenous zone of the mother's body is evoked, a source of attraction that blinds men and makes them irresponsible. The child born of this act is condemned to suffer and respect his mother. He says, "A man must suffer sometimes and respect his mother with remembrance and tears." From this detail, we can see that the maternal figure is neither denied nor rejected, unlike the lover or companion. the Duke rejects the idea of motherhood itself, but does not question the maternal figure or her role within the family. This is also evident in another passage of the tragedy, in which the Duke observes that when they conceived us, our mothers behaved as boisterously and animalistically as any other woman, or to use his words, they cried like any other bitch. And that thinking about this would cause one to lose respect for them. He says, our mothers cried thus when we were conceived, but what would respect be if these things were thought on? The implicit conclusion seems to be that it's better not to think of our mothers as just any woman. Going back to the previous monologue, the Duke says that his soul was set on spilling. The man's intention in the sexual act is only to achieve pleasure. This is once again evoked with a degrading vision and a verb indicating the release of seminal fluid, the physiological consequence of pleasure. For this tormented ruler, men are miserable, women are petty, and the value of life is very low. In the following page, he reiterates the randomness of his life and of any human beings when he says, I'm a man, I look, I live, and I touch. This comes of a certain day, and when a certain man and woman who thought not of me, but were itching. He uses a colloquial term, itching, to refer to sexual desire. This is his railing at the universe. The Duke associates unhappiness with contempt and repulsion for female sexuality, from which life originates. He refuses to explain the world from such a lowly and repugnant standpoint. He says, must I explain all the world from this low hollow? Why? I cannot explain it from any place. I may look from there and say the world does not smell nicely. The female sex is dehumanized, and eroticism and sensuality are negated. The indecency of the Duke's invective is directly linked to its truth, as he provocatively questions, should you ask if a man is decent when he says this? I say no, for nothing is decent that is true. Women are seen as potential or certain threat to a man's wisdom. He says, a man, if he be left too long to talk with a woman, will set up a whole nation a million years after. We talk of wisdom, but when there is a woman near, there is a skirt between us and our thoughts. This Duke's other monologue also expresses a very degrading view of the sexual act and female sexuality. Note the phrase, not every man will piss sperm into the first female pot. The verb piss is particularly strong, reducing ejaculation to the release of harmful or superfluous substances to be expelled and to a physiological need. In the Duke's view of the sexual act, women are evoked with a synecdoche, here expressed with a metaphor, female pot. Their sex is merely a receptacle that receives, which denotes their passivity. Women are verbally torn to pieces with reference to the part of the body that arouses the animalistic instinct to which man abandons himself, betraying his highest intellectual mission. When he adds that Plato is a great part in coming to her opening of legs, he again takes a misogynistic view by not naming the woman, but referring to a part of her body. The expression, till the night has been sore with my longing, and I have had to spill myself out alone for the unknown excess, seems to refer to masturbation. In the final part of the tragedy, the Duke's contempt for women, combined with this madness, turns into violence in the terrible scene of the murder. The Duchess begs him to spare her in the name of the love she has always had for him, but he first deliberately insults her with the epithet whore, although the Duke admits that this is not true and that he only intends to insult her, and then throws her off a parapet. Returning to the dialogue between the Duke and the doctor discussed earlier, we can now analyze the second question, and above all, the answer the Duke considers correct. The Duke asks, which is the viler, a virgin or a whore? Why, my lord, a whore? There are thou mistaken, for one lies with men and the other with her imagination. And complete the sentence on the right margin, which is as if she lay with a monster, better lie with asses than with the thought of man. We see that the idea emerges that the female mind and imagination are even more despicable than the female body because women are innately tethered to and dependent on sex. In the Duke's formulation, it seems that perversion is even more innate in women because even before they have experienced sex, their imagination is already perverse. Women are seen as those who capture and seduce men, the ultimate goal of their lives. As Barreto points out, the stereotype of the lascivious, tempting, naturally debauched woman who has no control over her sexuality recurs in misogynist literature worldwide. Giving in to carnal lust is a woman's appanage and a corollary of her inferiority. In fact, as we can see from his text written in the 1910s, Pessoa attributed intellectual faculties solely to men, confining women to a reproductive role. Consequently, love and sexuality is secondary for men, but fundamental for women. In the Book of Disquiet, Pessoa Soares even offers advice to unhappily married women on how to fulfill their sexual fantasies without betraying their husbands by using their imagination. It is imagination itself that condemns women to be impure. The woman's ability to be a sinner in her imagination underpins the Duke's concept that a virgin can be more repugnant than a whore. In another passage, the Duke revisits and expands upon the theme of his moral contempt for virgins at the bottom left of this page. He says that the idea of possessing them would make him vomit. He says, I could spew at the thought of having them. There is an explicit reference to female masturbation. Virgins, I know them too, that they o' nights lie or commune with the thoughts of men through their finger. I know them and where the itch takes them. The idea that what they have not yet done in practice is widely imagined and desired by them is reiterated, and this is a reason for the Duke's condemnation. The idea that sex is unworthy of a man but fundamental for a woman may lie at the root of the Duke's choice of chastity, together with his horror of the female sex. This horror may be the result of psychological trauma, as well as being culturally induced by misogynistic and supremacist ideals. Desire is considered by the Duke to be a form of slavery. In a statement made by the protagonist to Alberto, we read, I do take God for witness that my heart was richer than the vulgar hearts of men, more full of truth and easy with full eyes, more liberal of the blood and flesh of feeling than those which desire reddens or grief pants or covetous aching shrivels. Elevating himself above the vulgar hearts of men, the Duke emphasizes his freedom from the slavery of desire. In another passage, at the top of this other page, the Duke states, how fair is eating when or for a mind doth munch not, and love at heart, since souls do copulate not. It is right to love with the heart because spiritual love is pure. The soul does not stoop to performing base and impure acts such as fornication. This concept corresponds to the ideal of the superior man who, in an aristocratic manner, renounces love as physical contact with women and carnal plebeian pleasure. Instead, he devotes himself to abstinence and chastity in order to pursue higher goals. Pessoa expressed this concept in several writings from the 1910s, and it is also found in a passage from the incomplete novel Marcos Alves, whose protagonist is a virgin with no physical sexuality, which is considered incompatible with genius. The Duke, therefore, appears to be a character modeled on the ideological complex of that epoch, which viewed sexual abstinence as a means of allowing the realization of higher mental processes. What is certain is that the Duke of Parma's choice of chastity and hostility towards women were not adopted in a serene and non-confrontational manner. This can be inferred from a comment that Pessoa leaves on this sheet. He says, on Valerio's referring to the Duke's chastity and contempt of his wife, the Duke gets angry. It is evident that the theme of unexpressed, unrealized, frustrated sexuality is pervasive in Fernando Pessoa, emerging in works which coincidentally are also unrealized and unfinished. This is the case with the Duke of Parma and with the novel draft Marcos Alves, whose protagonist has no sex life. Marcos Alves is a frustrated character who has never lost his virginity, feels extremely uncomfortable around women, and is consequently the object of ridicule. Sex continues to dominate Marcos Alves' existence, occupying his thoughts constantly. In The Duke of Parma, the theme of sexual abstinence is intertwined with that of madness, real or rather simulated by the Duke to expose his enemies and bring them out into the open. This is achieved through his use of forceful language and his role as the reigning Duke, giving him the freedom to speak and act in a clear and direct manner. Just as he addresses his subordinates in this way to provoke them and make them incite suspicion of his madness, he expresses his invective against sex. Like Marcos Alves, the Duke is a character who does not practice sex, but it is in some way obsessed with it. The picture of Pessoa as a misogynist and supremacist who is uncomfortable with women and nauseated by female sexuality would seem clear and confirmed by the themes expressed in this incomplete tragedy. In reality, however, the picture is more complex, as Barreto pointed out in his essay. The most misogynistic and supremacist views are expressed in writings from the 1910s. Furthermore, as Barreto says, Pessoa's most intimate writings, such as the pages of various diaries or mediumistic communications, provide us with a more nuanced perspective insofar as they prove that this revulsion towards women coexists with an evident desire for heterosexual sex and love. In short, the idea that Pessoa abdicated all sexual desire is one that must be reduced, if not refuted, and several critics have written about this. Teresa Rita Lopes called Pessoa the false virgin in a 2008 article in which she refutes his alleged inability to love and shows clear expressions of a concrete and at times passionate heterosexual desire in his poetry and especially in intimate writings such as his private diary, transcripts of seances, and letters to Ofélia Queiroz. As for the love letters, Jerónimo Pizarro's recent edition is a point of reference that shows us that these were not written solely to Ofélia Queiroz. Evident sexual and emotional frustration emerges in the mediumistic writings, in which Pessoa communicates with English-speaking spirits, especially between 1916 and 1917, as well as the author's intimate need to change this aspect of his life. Indeed, most of the questions that Pessoa asked the spirits concerned the sexual sphere. Presumably produced in a semi-hypnotic state and without literary pretensions, these writings were later rejected by Pessoa as the product of a state of mental imbalance, as with the Duke's statements we can add. However, they probably offer a unique insight into these most intimate and hidden thoughts and inner dialogue. According to Richard Zenith, Pessoa's mediumistic writings are a form of self-theatralization that deals with the problem, the sexual problem, that the heteronyms were unable to resolve. As Barreto observes, the English-speaking spirits with whom Pessoa communicates, the most important of whom is Henry More, a 17th century English Platonic philosopher, appear to embody a kind of censorious and normative superego that counsels him against practicing chastity, masturbation, and homosexuality, that is, anything that precludes sexual activity with the opposite sex, and urges him to reverse the path he had previously followed in pursuit of his artistic and intellectual fulfillment. As Barreto suggests, we can notice a reversal of the previous argument about the relationship between literary work and sexuality or love. From obstacles to the noble artistic mission, love and sex now become its prerequisite. As with his indecision over whether to remain unpublished or to publish and seek fame and glory through recognition of his literary genius, Pessoa's changes of direction are never unambiguous or definitive. If anything, they denote a substantially unresolved conflict. These mediumistic writings represent an inner dialogue that reflects the conflict between the desire for a normal and fulfilling sex life and the inability to act on this desire. The idea of not wasting his genius by indulging base instincts and the difficulty of maintaining a choice of chastity for someone who appears to be much less chaste than he wishes to appear. This argument can be compared and contrasted with the Duke's choice of chastity. He is clearly a fictional character, not necessarily based on Pessoa himself. It could be hypothesized that the Duke's character is rooted in the misogynistic and supremacist views held in the 1910s. However, these views do not fully represent Pessoa's thoughts and feelings during the entire period in which he worked on the tragedy. In this regard, it is interesting to consider a couple of paratextual notes left by the author in the Duke of Parma's manuscripts. In a comment found at the bottom of this page regarding the characterization of the Duchess, we read, "The Duchess is an intensely feminine character, clear, pure, and loving." Notably, the Duchess character is defined by the adjective feminine, which is further emphasized by the adverb intensely. This clearly links the Duchess' characteristics strongly to her gender. However, this association is not negative. On the contrary, the intensely feminine character is further described using three highly positive adjectives: clear, pure, and loving. In other words, Pessoa's comment contradicts the Duke's character extremely negative view of women expressed throughout the tragedy. Another paratextual annotation that Pessoa adds to this manuscript, and that Elena showed us already yesterday, clearly shows the difference of opinion between the character and his creator on the subject of sexuality. The author wrote the following remark: explanatory, the Duke's constant sexual allusions and their purpose. They are not the author's. They belong to the author's conception of the character of the Duke. Richard Zenith, who quoted this comment in his biography of Pessoa, points out that the author rarely included this kind of disclaimer in his literature. Zenith proposes two possible interpretations. Because Pessoa does not normally go to the trouble of reminding us that his fictions are fictions, this disclaimer smacks of a sly admission. On the other hand, it is true that he did not obsess about sexual matters and mores like the Duke of Parma. In light of what Barreto has demonstrated and what the Duke's manuscripts contain, I am inclined to take Pessoa's assertion at face value. His distancing himself from his character also indicates an evident inner conflict, but above all, it represents Pessoa's irrepressible need to not be represented univocally and to establish himself as a multifaceted plural entity. Furthermore, in a famous letter to Armando Cortes Rodrigues dated 19 January of 1915, Pessoa wrote extensively about his nature as a dramatic poet and the sincerity of his writing under his heteronyms. The author argues that his own literature is sincere because it springs from genuine feelings. Pessoa created dramatic characters. Just as King Lear is not Shakespeare, but an independent character with his own thoughts and feelings, so, according to Pessoa, Caeiro, Campos, and Reis are independent entities with their own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Therefore, Pessoa was entitled to give voice to these characters and request that he not be identified with any of them, just as Shakespeare was entitled to express the soul of Lady Macbeth, who could not naturally be identified with her creator. Finally, we must consider another note from a 1912 diary held at the Casa Fernando Pessoa, transcribed by Pizarro, Ferrari, and Cardiello in Os Objetos. Preface to Duke of Parma. I have never shown what I am. In reality, this preface was never written, and that's another intriguing piece of trivia that contributes to the overall enigma. The way in which Pessoa wrote this note suggests that it could serve as the title for a planned preface, or that Pessoa himself understood it as a key to reading the Duke of Parma. We should consider who the I in the note refers to. Is it the Duke, or is it Fernando Pessoa himself, a man who never revealed his true self? We are, after all, dealing with a dramatic poet who always insisted on a rigorous distinction between himself and the heteronyms that spoke through their literary works. Imagine if he had not distanced himself from a mere character who was not even the author of his own work. In this light, I find Isabella Allegro Magalhães' concluding observation on the representation of the feminine in Pessoa's work particularly compelling, as she suggests a dialectic between absence and presence, negation and existence. She wrote, more or less, although denied, the feminine and sexuality remain in Pessoa's text, but only as figures created or configured in the text, in this function, which is intensified here, of language as the absence of the thing. Ultimately, for Pessoa, everything is constructed through language and exists solely within discourse. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Enrico, for this fascinating paper. I'm going to introduce your discussant. Mark Sabine is Associate Professor in Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at the University of Nottingham. He is the author of José Saramago, History, Utopia, and the Necessity of Error, and co-editor of volumes including with Anna Klobuchka embodying Pessoa, Corporeality, Gender, Sexuality, that we have just seen. He has published widely on Portuguese and Lusophone African writers, ranging from Essa de Queiroz and Fernando Pessoa to Luís Bernardo Onwana and Alberto, and also on cinema and cultural history, focusing in particular on the representation and remembrance of dictatorship and the anti-colonial struggle, and on issues of gender and sexuality. His current research focuses on queer men's identity, literary expression, and community during the Portuguese Estado Novo dictatorship. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much to all of the conference hosts and sponsors. I feel very, very privileged to be invited to contribute to this conference as somebody who can really best be described as a resting Pessoan, or perhaps a retired Pessoan, or even as somebody who's currently engaged in the study of the work of Mario Cesarini, a traitor to the Pessoan cause. Most of all, I'd like to thank Professor Enrico Martínez, both as project lead and conference organizer, but also, and of course, for a remarkably thorough and thoughtful paper that we've just heard. Enrico, if I may continue to refer to you by your first name, Enrico has offered us a comprehensive and nuanced examination of 4 themes recurring throughout the Duke's discourse, and has explored how this aspect of the Duke of Parma corpus might relate to the discussion elsewhere in Pessoa's writings of erotic desire and agency. The analysis that he's presented has great values, I believe, in a number of ways. Excuse me. The first of these being how his identification of commonalities between the Duke's discourse on the erotic, and in particular aspects of the Duke's virulent misogyny, might assist a conjectural dating of Pessoa's work on his play. Certainly, the relationships that Enrico identifies with the English poem Epithalamium of 1913, together with those to the embryonic novel Marcos Alves, whose composition has been dated by Richard Zenith to between 1909 and 1913, both support Geronimo Pizarro's theory that a first substantial phase of work on the Duke was, quote, completed around 1913 to 1914, end quote. Enrico, citing Barreto's 2011 essay, notes that Pessoa's most distasteful and vicious misogynist and supremacist views are expressed in writings from the 1910s. And Richard Zenith, in his 2021 biography, concurs with this, claiming, quote, Pessoa's misogyny would prove to have shallow roots. Within a few years' time, after his discomfort with women abated, So did his interest in arguing that they were less capable and less complex than men." End quote. However, if the presence of similar formulations of misogynist prejudice across these works supports our surmisals about the genesis of the Duke of Parma corpus, does the fact of Pessoa's uncharacteristically sustained attention to this same project, which he was still planning to finish and publish in the 1930s, require us to reconsider our belief that Pessoa may have moved on from this youthful denigration of women? I here would endorse Enrico's cautioning against reading the Duke of Parma corpus as confirmation that Pessoa was, throughout his life, a misogynist and male supremacist nauseated by female sexuality. Enrico draws our attention to Pessoa's explanatory annotation to manuscript 11 5D 83, the one that states that the Duke's, quote, constant sexual allusions are not the author's. And he suggests that we take this disclaimer, uncharacteristic though it is of Pessoa's practice, at face value. And the play is, after all, a tragedy. The Duke, as a dramatic creation presumably modelled after the Aristotelian definition of the tragic hero, is a figure of exceptional qualities who becomes the author of his own undoing by dint of his hamasha, his fatal flaw or error. If, as the note that Enrico showed us on manuscript 11 5D 28 informs, his Duchess, who he demeans, insults, and ultimately murders, is, quote, limpida, is limpido puro y amante, end quote, then presumably his disgust in her and in all womankind is either a symptom or a tragic consequence of that same hamartia. Enrico has organised his survey of sexuality and misogyny in the corpus, as he put it, not according to their archival order or the structure and development of the tragedy, but rather thematically. And I find this thematic organisation extremely helpful. Firstly, in order to distinguish those key tenets of the Duke's invective against women and against heterosexual congress. And secondly, in order for us to chart the connections between this and the misogynistic discourse and disavowals of sexual agency to be found elsewhere in Pessoa's writings. At the same time, though, I want to suggest that rather than reading the Duke of Parma as a showcase for a misogyny that makes women scapegoats for the carnal constitution and bestial instincts that the Duke laments are possessed by all humankind, we might read this corpus as an unfinished and perhaps unfinishable, but nevertheless never abandoned instalment of a textual rebellion launched by Pessoa against the constricting sexual diktats of his society. That is to say that we might assess its protagonist as being one element of a diverse literary repertoire of sexual identities that Pessoa fashioned, all of them deviating from and perhaps more significantly disturbing contemporary notions of what sexual normality and propriety were. The first emanations of this repertoire can be traced back at least to Pessoa's outputs of the early 1910s. As Richard Zenith points out, just within the first 6 months of 1913, Pessoa, quote, like a protean actor simultaneously playing different and even contradictory roles, was radically celibate in the Book of Disquiet, nervously expectant in his paean to marriage, the English poem Epithalamium, which focuses at length on the about-to-be deflowered bride, and also enamoured of a young man in the Book of the Other Love, end of quote. While for much of the history of exegesis of Pessoa's work, and at least until the discovery and publication in the early 2000s of a number of candidly homoerotic love poems, the dominant interpretations of Pessoa's engagements with the erotic were those of an attempted purgation or sublimation of discomforting desire. I would argue, and I wouldn't be the first to argue, that it's equally possible to read such texts as these, just as much, and also the better known and very vociferous sadomasochistic, voyeuristic and homoerotic odes of Álvaro de Campos, to read them as being gestures of defiance regarding the imperatives of heterosexual courtship, marriage, procreation and the consistent performance of masculinity that Pessoa's family and wider society would have expected him to observe. And Pessoa's two narrative English poems, Epithalamium and Antinous, I would argue, exemplify how this textual rebellion was one by no means always confined to the safety of Pessoa's famous trunk, or even to the safety of a circle of close literary admirers. Enrico mentioned how Pessoa claimed in 1930 that he'd written these two poems purely in order to purge from his mind an element of obscenity that was, as he puts it, certo estorvo para alguns processos mentais superiores, or a hindrance to some superior mental processes, end quote. This assertion of the purely therapeutic purpose of these poems' composition, however, rings false when we consider Pessoa's decision to publish both of these poems in a context of rarely publishing any of his work in book form. And in the case of Antinous, he published it not once but twice and planned to publish it a third time in Portuguese translation. Not only that, but he made these poems that he labelled obscene the basis for his bid for literary recognition in the English-speaking world. A decidedly quixotic decision which ended in his sending review copies to the leading British literary journals of the day. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's this kind of, as I say, this rather quixotic urge to advertise his interest, his exploration of these taboo and dissident desires in a way that that suggests there's something more going on here than an attempt at catharsis or purgation. Meanwhile, the Livro de Desassosego's commendation of absolute sexual abstinence as a form of mental hygiene might appear to us to be less obviously subversive. But we should bear in mind that it would have been anathema to contemporary policymakers and eugenicists across the political spectrum of the 1920s and 30s who, alarmed at Portugal's low birth rate, were maintaining that matrimony and procreation were fundamental to the Portuguese nation's recovery from its 19th century degeneracy, and hence that matrimony and procreation were almost a patriotic duty. Pessoa's investment in celibacy in the Livro do Desassossego and elsewhere is perhaps just one instance of his capacity to affirm manifestations of his own sexual abnormality as the origin or the correlative of his distinctive literary genius. As Anna Kłobucka and I summarized in the introduction to Embodying Pessoa, quote, Pessoa frequently theorizes his specifically dramatic path of depersonalization as inherently linked to the psychosexual disorders that stalked both the pseudoscientific and the popular imaginations of his day, that is, masturbation, transsexualism or sexual inversion, and hysteria. And I would suggest that Enrico's paper has shown us how, in the Duke of Parma corpus, we find that this textual corpus kind of partakes of to differing degrees of all three of the kind of key emanations of Pessoa's rebellion or his kind of affirmation of sexual of taboo or despised sexual dissidence, whether it's the evocation of homosexual love sublimated into, as in Antinous sublimated into art, or the abasement of heterosexual intercourse as scatological and bestial, as in Epithalamium, or the affirmation of radical celibacy in the Livro do Desassossego. And with much of the essential intertextual cartography established by Enrico's paper, and in order fully to appreciate the significance of the connections that he identifies, I'd like to suggest now that we proceed to thinking about how the Duke of Parma material was intended to function as a Shakespearean tragedy. I personally can't resist the urge to speculate as to what message, argument, or dilemma we, as readers or critics, might have identified in this play had Pessoa taken it closer to completion. Or to put it another way, I can't resist asking what might be the actual tragedy, or perhaps the multiple tragedies of the Duke, and in what way is the Duke's sexual panic and his commendation of celibacy, so prominent in those textual fragments that Pessoa actually completed and preserved, implicated in this tragedy? My tentative interpretation of the play's tragedy is one that is indebted to Enrico's reference to Pessoa's invocation, both in the Book of Disquiet and elsewhere, of that figure of the superior man. By identifying the intertextual resonance of this figure in the Duke of Parma corpus, Enrico presents evidence to suggest that Pessoa's reconception of the Aristotelian or Shakespearean tragic hero would have corresponded closely to his conception of that superior man. And I think it's safe to say that when Pessoa was taking the Shakespearean tragedy as a model, he would not have been seeking to replicate it or even emulate it. He would have been seeking to transcend it, to turn it on its head, to come up with something kind of beyond Shakespeare and beyond the Shakespearean model of the hero. And that could be not a man of action, such as Macbeth or Othello in Shakespeare, but a man of inaction, whose very inaction was the mark of his heroism, his superiority. So, running with this idea of the superior man as the hero of Pessoa's conception of a kind of post-Shakespearean tragedy, calls to mind a Socratic dialogue of 1913, in which Pessoa's interlocutors talk of a supreme type of man who is uninterested in, quote, the pursuit of normal sexual pleasure, and who will therefore replace it with the sexual pleasure afforded by sublime friendship with other men. And it made me wonder, might the tragedy, or perhaps just the first component of the tragedy that is sketched, that can be tentatively surmised from the Duke of Parma corpus, might it be the Duke's sundered relationship with Alberto, who he calls, quote, the truest philosopher I ever met, before expressing and suppressing the urge to kiss him, since, as he put it, he cannot do it, he would do it were it not in decency. The successful superior man is the one who, quote, aprende a sentir tudo sem o sentir diretamente, porque sentir diretamente é submeter-se à ação da coisa sentida. Or to translate into English, the man who learns to feel everything without feeling anything directly, because to feel directly is to surrender to the action of the thing that is felt. Through a discipline of radical affective disengagement and its substitution by a kind of imaginative meta-affective engagement, and only through this discipline, the superior man may achieve a state of self-sovereignty, self-reliance, and consequently of freedom untrammeled by reliance on or commitment to either his material environment or its other human inhabitants. Passages of the Livro do Desassossego indicate the contribution to this discipline of disengagement, or contribution to this discipline of disengagement of what he calls abdication, the avoidance, wherever possible, of actions whose consequences might drag the aspiring superior man back into a state of reliance on or surrender to other humans or circumstances. In this context, the superior man's need to, as Enrico puts it, renounce love as physical contact with women and carnal plebeian pleasure, and to instead devote himself to abstinence and chastity in order to pursue higher goals, is paramount not simply because sexual intercourse is a bestial response to frivolous urges, but because procreation is, along with murder and suicide, the most drastically consequential form of agency of which a human being is capable. Could the crowning tragic irony of the Duke of Parma therefore be that the Duke, who, as the scion of an aristocratic dynasty and charged with the duties of governing and of producing an heir, is prevented from abdicating and is hence driven to a state of mad and obsessive revulsion for the procreation that he wishes to avoid, and in that state commits an equally consequential and thereby enslaving act, murder. As always in Pessoa's texts, and I would say, I believe almost invariably by intention, other interpretations are available. I have not begun to consider here how the Duke's affective and erotic discourse is framed by the madness that is that we don't know to be either genuine or feigned in the play. But it would be both consistent with Pessoa's love of paradox and self-contradiction, and consistent with his customary desire to trump the achievements and invert the arguments of those authors and philosophers that he admired and wrote about. If his ultimate aim with the projected tragedy, the projected neo-Shakespearean tragedy of the Duke of Parma, were to leave its audience uncertain of whether the root of its hero's inexorable downfall or peripeteia was on the one hand his obsessive rejection of his allotted sexual vocation, or alternatively his failure successfully to defend that personal choice. I'm going to leave it there, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. Enrico, you're probably willing to answer Mark's question in his discussion, but since we are running a little bit late, maybe we are just taking 5 minutes to see if someone from the audience has some question. What do you think? Or remarks, or...
Okay, Diego.
You have to speak here.
Yeah, okay, no, I'll speak up. I think people can hear me. So, remarks, really, and maybe stuff that we can talk about later, obviously coming from sort of my own perspective. Very interesting, that passage, the one at the beginning about you are a part of my soul, etc., etc. That's got echoes of Shelley and the idea of the epipsyche in Epipsychidion. I'm sure that Alessandro will have a lot more to say about the Renaissance discourse of misogyny. I could hear echoes of Othello, speeches, but also the White Devil, Webster, where Cardinal says, "What is whore? Shall I define whore for you?" Third thing, there might be the Byronic echo if Pessoa knew the first canto of Don Juan when it comes to Plato. And I'll tell you about it some other time. And then finally, I thought that the whole thing was shot through with what Julia Kristeva calls the abject and abjectness. which seems to be a kind of like the basis for a dynamic that is very much in the play of displacement pushing away. But then what happens is that what is pushed away, the object, which is this extremely physical, liquid, oozing, decomposing kind of situation, keeps coming back as a kind of a ghostly revenant, whereby I think we enter that kind of cycle, which I think also Mark was talking about, of an unresolvable, how would he, how could you resolve that kind of constant toing and fro, which I think is very much in the logic of the action.
Because there are a couple of instances in which the Shakespearean echo as it were was like a cursor. For example, there was a quotation on our mother's cried when we were conceived, and there is much about nothing. My mother cried, but then a star danced, and there it was born. Of course, mothers cry when people are born, not when they're conceived. So in a way, I thought I was getting a bit worse. And the other was the fist sperm into the first female thought, which is really the expansion of spirit and the waste of shame. It's the first line of sonnet 139. And the idea of wasting your sperm into a waste of shame becomes really gross. And as you were saying, abject. So yeah, it is using Shakespeare to make it a bit worse.
Of course, you know this better than me, then I can only thank you for these remarks and receive them very gratefully.
Could I just say, you mentioned you mentioned Othello and this idea of taking Shakespeare and making it worse, making it more extreme. I mean, the clearest example of that I spotted was the relationship between Iago's line in Othello, I think Act 1, Scene 3, making the beast with two backs, which Pessoa transforms into the two-arsed beast. You know, it's this there's this sort of the scatologization of the image, yeah. I mean, I mentioned epithalamium because I think it's really interesting the way that the Duke of Parma and epithalamium are there's this sort of almost this sort of mirror imaging of these two equally kind of grotesque perspectives on heterosexual intercourse that is governed by the principle of hegemonic masculinity. That in epithalamium celebrates male domination and male aggression in the sex act, but does so in this incredibly sort of grotesque way, and also kind of it's not just the bridegroom; it's the whole society is kind of complicit in this sort of patriarchal and even nature and time, when he says this great muscle day that like a courser tears the bit of time. But on the other hand, in the Duke of Parma, you've got, as you say, this sort of the adoption of that dominant hegemonic male sexual role is it becomes abject. It's disgrace, and the image of semen is the different ways the two texts use the image of semen kind of illustrates that. But I'm rambling on, so I'll shut up.
Okay, thank you very much, and we are moving on to the next session. Thank you.